There we go. Thank you, Christine. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Good afternoon. I am Alex Matthews. I will, next year at this time, God willing, be the rabbi of Congregation Nahavas Achim, but for now, I am very happy and proud to be the congregational leader here. I'm so overjoyed that you decided to join us this afternoon. It's great to see so many people in the room. You're all invited back any Saturday morning you would wish to recreate this. And it's also great to have people zooming in from all over the country, near and far. A couple just logistical announcements. It is not Shabbat, but I'm still going to encourage you to put your phones on silent or turn them off. Although you can take pictures if you want, just please do so respectfully. No like holding your phone up and blocking anyone's view or anything like that. But yeah, please turn cell phones off. There is water in the back of the room and the AC is on downstairs. One of the downsides of being in a beautiful historical building is that it is not upgraded with air conditioning for this large sanctuary. And so we're doing pretty okay with the weather forecast, but if you feel too warm, need to take a break, let yourself into the social hall, enjoy the AC for a couple minutes. There's some beautiful Judaica and a historic display set up, so feel free to do that. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome you here. In just a minute, I will invite Mayor Reardon up to present a proclamation to our president, Debbie Parati. Mayor Reardon and I, 2 hours ago, were at the poetry reading downtown. I think in a different city, in a different reality, we would have been like motorcaded up here in a black SUV. But as was, we kind of went our separate ways and changed. And I'm very glad that he's here with us this afternoon. And in the spirit of that poetry reading, to get us started, I just want to read a very brief poem by the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai. It's called Infinite Poem. Within the brand new museum, an old synagogue. Within the old synagogue, me. Within me, my heart. Within my heart, a museum. Within the museum, a synagogue. Within it, me. Within me, my heart. Within my heart, a museum. And I can just keep going for 2 hours on that loop if you want. But I think, in the spirit of coming from this poetry reading, we're celebrating 125 years in Newburyport. Almost that many years in this building, which is older than 125 years old, and just thinking about kind of the grandness of the history that exists here. And I don't want to call it a museum, because museum has that connotation of stuffy and old and kind of the past, but it is a living museum in that, I am here and my heart is here, and so many of you have been here for so long, and your parents and your ancestors, and we find ourselves in this wonderful place and in this wonderful community. And it really feels special to have an opportunity to celebrate that history and to bring together so many people who have played such an important role. They and their families have played such an important role in making this community a part of the fabric of the city of Newburyport and the greater Newburyport area for so long. And it's really an honor to welcome up Mayor Reardon to also be a part of that history and present us with something that will go right next to the charter, in part of making this almost like a little museum. And so once again, I want to thank you all for being here, and it is my honor and pleasure to call up Mayor Sean Reardon and Temple President Debbie Parati to this podium.
Well, it's so great to be here today. I have a lot of fond memories growing up, coming to Temple throughout my years. And it's been a busy day too, so it's nice we could make a quick change and then get here. When I ran for mayor, they don't tell you the cool things you get to do, and this is definitely one of the cool things I get to do is read this proclamation, so I'm gonna give it a shot here. Whereas we are gathered here today to celebrate Congregation Avas Ahim, one of the oldest Jewish congregations in Massachusetts, and the congregation's 125 years as the spiritual home of the Jewish community here in Newburyport. Whereas Jewish families have called Newburyport home since the post-Civil War era and have made contributions to the cultural, business, political, and religious life of the community for over 150 years. And whereas the Commonwealth of Massachusetts granted a charter to 17 members of Newburyport's Jewish community on August 3rd, 1896, which first established Congregation of Avas Achim as the nonprofit religious organization. And whereas the historic building, Congregation Avas Achim, calls home dates back to 1865, and the congregation has worshiped in this synagogue since 1933. And whereas the Congregation Avas Achim provides a sanctuary for religious, spiritual, cultural, educational, and social growth for the diverse Jewish community of Newburyport. And whereas the congregation's missions includes a commitment to improving the community through tzedakah, charity, and tikkun olam, repairing the world. And whereas Congregation Avas Achim has planned events to celebrate its anniversary and educate the community on the congregation's history and role in the city. Now, therefore, I, Sean R. Reardon, Mayor of the City of Newburyport, do hereby make this official proclamation in honor of Congregation Avas Achim and congratulate Congregation Avas Achim on celebrating 125 years as the spiritual home of Newburyport's Jewish community. Given under my hand and the seal this 12th day of June in the year 2022. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Reardon. It's a true honor to accept this proclamation in honor of the entire congregation. This year, we've had a year-long celebration in honor of our 125th year in this community. And we've had several events and programs, but this one is especially meaningful because we have so many community members here to celebrate with us. It's also personally meaningful to me because my children, who are sitting in the back, are the third generation here at CAA. My parents moved here in the 70s when my mom was pregnant with me. You'll hear from them later. I grew up in this synagogue, and I'm blessed to have my children here as well. Without further ado, I'd love to introduce Christine Malpica. She is a public historian, among many other things, and she's been a real partner to me in planning this event and also working on the long-term history project, which she'll tell you more about. She's put a tremendous amount of work into today's program, so I want to thank her and introduce Christine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie, and thank you, Alex and Mayor Reardon. It is such a pleasure and privilege to be part of this wonderful team, and Debbie has done such an incredible job pulling this together, along with the whole team, so thank you. Yes, I am a community organizer. Some of you may know me. I wear many hats. I'm also a public historian. What does that mean? Well, it means what we're doing today. We are making history. This is living history, and we are preserving stories. Why am I here today? I'm going to tell you a couple of stories from my family. My great-great-grandfather was one of the early rabbis here in Newburyport, long before this beautiful synagogue was purchased and before the 1907 one was purchased as well. When he sent back to Lithuania for his wife and children, her name was Molly, she got on a ship and, like many immigrants, came with all of her children and steerage and every possession that she owned. And when they got to London, a child had an eye infection. And they said, "I'm sorry, you can't go on." That ship went on without them, and it sank. And that's why I'm here today. Incredibly, Molly met somebody from her shtetl from Lithuania in Liverpool, of all places, and helped her to make her way to meet her husband, Samuel, who was actually in mourning, sitting Shiva, thinking that his whole family had perished when they showed up. It must have been like ghosts. That's why I'm here today. My great-great-grandmother ran a boarding house here for new immigrants. This community has always welcomed new immigrants, and that's what my stories are about today. A young man came in. He had escaped the Tsarist army, which was a fate that many young Jews had to face. And he made his way at 16 years old by himself, sleeping on tailor benches. He learned the trade. He got here. He came to the boarding house. He met his future wife, Agnes. They had 5 children, one of which was my grandmother, and that's why I'm here today. He became known as the mayor of Inn Street. You can see a picture up here on the right-hand side. That was his tailor shop for over half a century. One of his best clients and dear friends was Henry Bailey Little, the Institution for Savings president. And in the early 30s, when many people were losing their homes because of the Great Depression, our family was about to lose their home. My great-grandfather went to Henry and said, "I just can't make my mortgage payments." Henry said, you know what, Joe, you're a hard worker. These are hard times. 5 years, he put a moratorium on saving the house. And that's part of why I'm here today as well. A few years later, the tables were turned, and Henry needed a fine new suit to win over some new customers for the bank. And he came to Joseph and said, I'm sorry, I don't really have the money to front you for the suit. Joseph said, that's okay. I know you're good for it. And just a couple of years later, when the war broke out, Henry came to Joseph and said, I just want to let you know, Joseph, I have a secret room in my house, and I will hide you if the Nazis ever come. You don't ever need to worry, you and your family. That's what Newburyport is about to me. And in the 1960s, when the Redevelopment Authority came to take his tailor shop by eminent domain, he didn't resist. He used to joke that a man named Irving Renewable came to take his store. That was the little inside joke. We're not sure if he, did it on purpose, but it's a great joke. So Irving Renewable came, took his shop, but that's okay, because he said Newburyport has been really, really good to me. And in 1971, just after Joseph Lebman passed, his 5 daughters, including my grandmother Jeanette and Ethel Youngman, whose son Carl is one of our speakers here today, donated to the city of Newburyport and to the public library the Lebman Judaic collection. You see a picture up there of my grandmother and my great-grandparents. And that continues today in its 51st year. So I am so pleased and proud to continue this legacy as a member of this community, of this congregation, and as a public historian. But I am not the first one. I am standing on the shoulders of giants, and I'm going to tell you about 2 of those people, one of whom is our moderator today. The other one is in this picture. Her name was Bertha Woodman. Some of you may know her, and her son, Jonathan. I'm going to play you a little bit of a clip from Bertha. She started an oral history project in 1980, and those tapes are archived in the library today. You can go and listen to them. She wrote a book on the Jews of Haverhill, and she intended to write one on the Jews of Newburyport. She never quite finished, but her son, Jonathan, of course, was a very well-known architect, and he was partly responsible for renovating Inn Street, where my great-grandfather had his tailor shop after Irving Renewable. So I'm going to play you a little clip, if Noah can cue it up. We were working on the audio earlier. Let's see if it works. It might be a little fuzzy, so please excuse the quality.
This is Bertha Woodman, 7 Lawrence Street, Haverhill, Mass. Visiting with Jeanette Gelt, Titcomb Street, Newburyport, to meet with a group of Newburyport natives and full-time Jewish residents who might possibly be interested in recording some of their memories of life in Newburyport. You probably wonder why I'm interested in Newburyport. I have ties here, 45 years of ties, as a matter of fact. And Louis, as you know, is a Newburyport native. Jonathan is a Newburyport native who's come back to make his place here in the community and to do things for the community. That's our whole purpose in having children, was to make them useful and citizens so that they could come back to where they came from and establish themselves and do something. So that's my connection here with Newburyport. I have been working.
So that's our dear, beloved, late Bertha Woodman. And I was privileged to know her at the end of her life. And her legacy lived on in the continuation of a project with our next speaker and our moderator today. And we are going to continue this oral history project moving forward. So I would like to, in a moment, introduce you to Anna Smolowitz. And she's a person really that needs no introduction, but I'm going to give her one anyway. And you may not know a few things about her, like she taught Hebrew school here for a few years. She also wrote a thesis at Brandeis titled Jews in the Sticks, which is a great title. And based on her thesis about why did the first generation of Jews come to this little Yankee village. Anna also mounted a public exhibition downstairs of photographs of the Jewish community. and her partner Frank Dalton at the time was helping with this. And it was downstairs where we're going to have our reception afterwards, and where you're all invited to see memorabilia and slides. Many of you know Anna as the daughter of Holocaust survivors, renowned playwright of Terezin, Children of the Holocaust, which has toured the entire world, including the concentration camps of Auschwitz, Terezin, Berlin and Cuba and other places. This is its 51st year, an incredible achievement. Anna came to Newburyport 43 years ago to pursue her theater career and start a company, and she did, Theater in the Open. It continues today. She also helped found the Firehouse Center for the Arts, and in 1984, Terezin won the American TV Award. In 1998, she was given the Newburyport Mayor's Award for Theater in Newburyport. In 2008, she was awarded the ADL Leadership Award, and just last month, she was given an honorary doctorate by President Biden's Volunteer Service Committee from the Global International Alliance for Social Justice and Peace Work. She continues her work in theater as a hospice chaplain and outstanding commitment to human rights education. It is truly my pleasure and honor to know and work with her and other events. Please welcome Anna Smolowitz.
I tried learning my lines for today, and then I thought I might get verklempt, so I'll just read them. For all those of you who are not Jewish, verklempt means feeling it deeply in your heart. Thank you, Christina, for that lovely introduction. And I welcome you as well to Ahavas Ahim's 125th anniversary celebration. I also want to thank Mayor Reardon, Alex, Debbie, and Joel, and all of those who participated, the members of this community who will be speaking shortly and telling us their stories. I want to tell you that I taught Hebrew here, as you heard, 38 years ago. It was downstairs. And I got married right up those stairs to my beloved husband, Alan, right there. That's where the verklempt part comes in. And I met Alan in the Hebrew classroom. And I just want to say that it pays to teach Hebrew. Christina recently suggested that I change the title of my 1986 Jewish Studies thesis at Brandeis from the title Jews in the Sticks to Jews in a Yankee City. I give much of my credit to that work, to that study, to Bertha Woodman and to Sid Weiner and to Frank Dalton, who was Fran Dalton in the late part of her life. She was an amazing photographer. And the three of us together went from house to house of the early families. Sid led us to those homes, interviewed them, took photos of their photos, and eventually I wrote a thesis and created an exhibit that was in the hall downstairs, and it was on June 3rd, 1986. And I got married on August, no, just kidding. But a few months later, I married. So I had an incredible summer here at this synagogue that I'll never forget. Sid told us that there was a Samson Levy who was Newburyport Postmaster General in the late 1870s. She also told us the residents who we came to meet were the Jewish settlers who came in the early part of the 20th century. She said they came from Eastern Europe, Lithuania, Russia, Ukraine, because of the pogroms, because of the Tsar's mission to eradicate the Jews of Russia. They couldn't work in the factories when they came here because they kept Shabbat. and they would have to work on Saturdays. So they kept moving north to Salem, and eventually Newburyport and Portsmouth, and on into the real sticks, Maine and northern New Hampshire. And I think there's a few Jews in Vermont as well. But at the time, they came here without work, without anything they could possibly make money at. And so what they did was set up a kiosk or little booths in Market Square and sold things like, you know, shoelaces and home goods and cloth, everything that's important, eventually wood. And they made their living, their meager living, but enough money, as you'll hear from our next speaker, Bonnie Tucker, enough money to build a community here, build houses, a synagogue, and it all started with a horse and buggy in Market Square. Their family stories are going to be told again long-term. Those of you who will not hear enough today, they're going to be online. You'll hear more interviews at length to know the full stories of these wonderful families that came here and settled here and stayed here in the descendants that you'll meet today. When interviewing the descendants of Benjamin Krajewski, who later became Ben Cray, Elaine and Ty Tucker, if some of you remember them, told me a story that I'll never forget. Elaine and Ty eventually ran Cray's store, elegant clothing for men and women. It's right next to the Unitarian Church on Pleasant Street, or it was for many years. The story, and it'll be brief, in 1961, the Unitarian minister, Reverend Bert Steeves, next door to Cray's, invited a guest speaker and an author named Gordon Hall to lecture for his church on a Sunday to combat the growing prejudicial sentiments in Newburyport. Steeves was concerned about issues around local racial prejudice and anti-Semitism. Today, these hate groups would be known as supremacist, the Ku Klux Klan, and the American Nazi Party here in Newburyport. I was stunned. Reverend Steeves received a telegram the night before Dr. Hall was to speak. The telegram was from George Lincoln Rockwell, founder of the American Nazi Party, announcing that he would be attending along with his brown shirt, swastika-wearing colleagues and marching up State Street, distributing leaflets. A few students were recruited from Newburyport High School. They even went to Arlington, Virginia to train for the march here in Newburyport. I bet a lot of you don't know this. And it's in the Daily News, by the way, and the Boston Globe, 1961. We will have that online for you if you'd like to read the whole article. The rest of this story comes straight from Elaine and Ty Tucker. You know how I feel about your parents. When Elaine found out very quickly that Rockwell was coming the next day, she approached Rabbi Shalom Yellen, may he rest in peace, who was connected with the local community churches, ministers, priests, and a friend of Reverend Steeves. They decided as a church community to call every member of the UU congregation, inviting those folks to make signs the night before. The signs read, "Not in our town," "Haters in Newburyport not welcome," and "Go home." Folks of all ages showed up the next day. People in wheelchairs and crutches and grandmas and grandpas and children crossed the street, State Street, at the Fowles stop. And they crossed arms and they held the signs, waiting for the Nazi parade to begin. Rockwell never showed up. His colleagues did, however, and were chased away by over 100 angry Unitarians. And that's not easy. Meanwhile, Rockwell was being held in the Newburyport jail because the police are so friendly and helpful to the Jewish community and the Unitarian and all Newburyport. And they arrested him the night before. And they were really struggling to what to arrest him for, and they figured it out. He signed into a Salisbury motel with the name Mr. Ginsburg. That's what you call chutzpah. So that was a false identity, and so, yay, he was arrested and he couldn't show up. Let's clap for that. He went to Boston the next day, and because of what happened in Newburyport and how fast Unitarians call each other, 5,000 people showed up in the Boston Common to. It's amazing, just amazing. The Jewish community was grateful, the entire community was grateful. And afterwards, the Daily News asked Reverend Steves about the whole incident, and he said, and this is how I will close, if you allow a climate to develop where the tragedy of hate crimes can take place, well, there is something seriously wrong with this country. There is either justice or no justice, and you just have to keep working for it, said Reverend Steves. All right, so I just here, may his memory be a blessing. As we continue, we will invite our speakers now to come up, and even though I took a half an hour, they get 5 minutes. Kidding. And they're going to share their memories and recollections of their life in Jewish Newburyport and here at Ahavas Ahim Synagogue. Also, if you have questions, Joel Grossman will lead the Q&A. Please hold your applause after each speaker. Joel is my good friend and colleague in the work, in hospice work. He's also a very fine actor. And he has led a Kabbalah study here for some years, which has also evolved into meditation, which has happened on Yom Kippur. After this entire program, you're invited to come downstairs, and there will be a slideshow, and there will be the 125th history down there as well, lots of artifacts and stories. And also, that is a good time for you to ask questions of folks you didn't have a chance to speak with. I now invite Bonnie Tucker, and here's the verklempt part. I have known Bonnie for 43 years. I met her when she was a mere youth, and I was also very young. And kidding. I think I could have been your teacher at the time we met, but Bonnie, in all these years, has become my teacher in so many ways. I am so proud and honored to be your friend these years and to know Elaine and Ty and your brother and your sisters. I am honored to know you. Thank you, Bonnie. Welcome.
Thank you, Anna, and the honor is all mine. And I'm so proud to be a part of this community, and this community that, can you hear me? And this is my acting teacher. And this community that stood down anti-Semitism and racism. And as we know, the battle is not won yet, so we are still involved. But I'm here today to just talk about how my family arrived and how we became part of the Jewish community in Newburyport. And that started with my great-great-grandfather, Abraham David Krajewski. And he was born, as far as we know, in 1868 in a shtetl outside of Kyiv in the Ukraine, which was part of Greater Russia at the time. He became a rabbi in the village, a rabbinical scholar, And he enjoyed being a rabbi, but I have to say he also didn't like taking orders from the congregation. So he was a very worldly man as well, and he was also an entrepreneur. And that's, I think, something that stands out as being very unique at the time. I don't know, yes, you can see it up there. You see the little czarist seal. I have a document that was his passport that he was granted by the government to be allowed to travel outside of the shtetl. And this was, and trade, and this was very unique and unusual. But he knew, because he was not a fan of the Tsar, I believe it was Alexander III, and he knew that he had to get his family out of Russia. So with this paper, he was allowed to travel, and he contracted with peasants in the neighboring villages, and they cut down trees, and he had a horse and cart, and he went outside of the shtetl and sold that wood to the Gentiles. And it was through his contacts with the Gentiles that he was able to establish the relationships to get his family out. And his wife was Kaya Olkowski, and they had many children. At that time, they had 11 children. And she had family in Chelsea, Massachusetts. So he decided, he sent his family to Moscow because he had the resources to do that, and thought it would be better for them to be in Moscow than to be in this little shtetl town outside of Kiev. So they were in Moscow, and he came with his oldest son, Harry, to the United States in 1907. And we have not been able to find any record of Abraham or Harry in the Ellis Island records. So somehow they made it to Boston. And once they were in Boston, they stayed with Ida's family in Chelsea, Massachusetts. The interesting thing was the only work he could get was as sorting rags. And he felt that as a rabbi and a rabbinical scholar, sorting rags was really beneath him. And so he decided he had to get another plan. And he heard that there was a gentleman who had these baskets, and my mother called it baskets of notions. And I think notions are things that like a tailor would use, like buttons and needles and thread. And he convinced him that because he was a rabbi, he could trust him because Abraham had no money. He just arrived with his son, Harry. So he trusted him, he gave him the basket of notions, and he started going door to door, peddling, selling these notions. But he realized that there was less competition for those goods outside of Chelsea. So he was able to move with Harry into a barn. And what I hear is it was a legitimate barn with like cows and chickens and everything. And they lived there for 2.5 years, but he was able to save money. And he heard during that time, I believe it was somewhere between 1909 and 1910, that they were looking for a Hebrew school teacher in Newburyport. So he came to Newburyport, and he became the Hebrew school teacher. He became the cantor, and he sent for his family from Russia. 2 children had died of diphtheria in Moscow before they came, but the rest of the family, you can see the picture of some of them, they came over. And once he was in Newburyport, he continued his entrepreneurial spirit, and he was able to, along with being a Hebrew school teacher and a cantor, he was able to get a horse and cart, and he saw that there was a market outside of Newburyport up in New Hampshire. So he started selling his wares and trinkets up in New Hampshire. And that led to opening a store in Market Square in approximately around 1910. And then his youngest son, Benjamin Krajewski, worked in the business, and he took over when Abraham died, and he opened a store on State Street next to Abe Edelstein. And he was famous, of course, for always smoking a cigar with a white cigar holder, a very thin cigar. and he was a very dapper dresser. And when my parents got married in 1946, he gave my father and mother the job of running the men's side of the store so they could learn the trade and learn the business, because he knew that when he was ready to retire, that they were going to take over the business. So and he wanted them to be prepared. So they took over the business eventually, and they were renting that same space next to Abe Edelstein, Quality Shoes, I think it was called. And they were able to buy the old Lutton Kellys at 24 Pleasant Street. And that became craze. And one last thing that I'll say is that Abraham was a very religious man. And there was another synagogue before this synagogue that was somewhere around the Tannery. Was it Independence Way? Somebody corrected me. Independence Street. So somehow, once his family came, he managed to buy a house next to the synagogue, because he said he had to live next to the synagogue. But in order to afford it with all his family, and he was the only one working, he took in roomers. Not boarders, roomers, there's a difference. Roomers only got the room, boarders got food. So, and that's really the inception of my family in Newburyport, and hence, here I am. So, thank you.
My name is Carl Youngman, and it's just so nice to see so many people in this building. It's wonderful. When I'm asked where I'm from, I begin by saying I came from Newburyport. Everything I am, everything I've become, began and was due to the fact I was born in Newburyport. I was lucky. Every Jewish child needs an important and enduring Jewish home, a tikkun olam. And this building, for me, represented that tradition. It's tradition of our people, our lifelong celebration of the Jewish presence in this city of Newburyport. It's important to keep this building, and it's important that it nourishes our sense of history. And it was here that I was taught high expectations were expected of me. I was taught that I had to work hard to get those expectations as well. I grew up in a 6 to 8 block area. My home, my family, my grandparents, my synagogue, my schools, and my playgrounds, all within a 6 to 8 block area. Life was simple. Family was really, really important. And every Sunday, the whole family had to be at my grandmother's house, or else. And it may be hard for today's children to understand that, because we've lost that in this country. I had all the toys I ever wanted. One hollow pink ball and my mother's broomstick that I had to take off her broom. That was it. I played with that pink ball every day against the steps of my home at 15 Titcomb Street. I hit singles, I hit doubles, and occasionally I would hit a home run into Mrs. Walton's yard across the street. She was my first grade teacher, and she was also my mother's first grade teacher. It cost 10 cents. That was my entire play toy. It was my best friend, and every day I went out and played, but I only had one rule: be home before your father gets home. I went to the Kelly School. I went to Hebrew school on Mondays, Thursdays, and on Saturdays I was here. And the old-timers in this synagogue supervised the teaching here. And if you made a mistake, they would hit you with a switch on your hand. They had high expectations of me. And Rabbi Yellen finally came to be the calming influence from the Orthodox way of instilling discipline among Jewish students. I was the Kohen in the class, and it was expected that I would lead the children's service, which I did. I had to be good because high expectations came to me from this building. I said I was lucky to be in Newburyport, and I was accepted by the community. I was invited to go everywhere I wanted to go. I loved raising money with my little red wagon. I raised money for the Jimmy Fund, the charity sponsored, by the way, by the Boston Braves. Yes, the Braves, not the Red Sox. My Little League team was also the Braves, and I joined DeMolay. I was accepted. I became master of the chapter here. I got an International Chevalier Award. Life was good. Life was fun. But I have to fill out life here with some balance, because it wasn't always easy growing up. 3 quick stories. My baseball team, like Newburyport, was not only Christian, but mostly Catholic. There were 2 Catholic schools, a separate Catholic high school, and they had their own football team in addition to the Clippers from Newburyport High School. I had to wait outside the Immaculate Conception Church on Wednesdays for catechism class to get over so we could play baseball. And one day the priest asked, why was I waiting outside? I told him, he said, oh, just come on in, which I did. It took less than 3 minutes for one of my teammates to ask the priest, Father, is it true? Did the Jews kill Christ? And I remember the priest came over and he put his hand right on my head and he said, yes, it's true. The Jews killed Christ. My best friend was Jimmy Legoulis. Jimmy is well known in town. Matter of fact, I had lunch with him this afternoon. When he's not in Palm Beach, he still practices law here. He was poor like me. His mother worked in a shoe factory. He had no father in his house at all, but the same story. He invited me to go to the Greek Orthodox Church so I could play with him after he had to go to school. And I can still see the long black robe of the Greek priest in front of me with this big cross. Same question. Did the Jews kill Christ? Yes, he said, it's true. One final story of the times. I had a girlfriend. She also was Catholic, and we could only see each other on Saturday night. It was at the Immaculate Conception Church, of course, which was run by the Catholic Youth Organization. You had to join, so I did. In those days as a teenager, my God was Elvis Presley. Everyone loved Elvis. He had a great song that I used to sing all the time. Please wear my ring around your neck. So if you had a steady girlfriend, you would give her a ring and she would put it on a chain and she'd wear it around her neck. Debbie Zabriskie was my girlfriend and she was the most beautiful girl in Newburyport, no doubt. And we danced every Saturday night at the CYO dance at the Immaculate Conception Church. And I gave her the ring my grandfather brought here from Latvia, and he had given it to me. I was so proud and so happy. One day I got home from school and I had a letter from Debbie, and it said she'd gone to confession, and the priest told her that if she ever saw that Jewish boy again, she would never be able to get into heaven. So I'm giving you the ring back. But I want to end where I began. I was lucky. I was lucky to have been born in Newburyport. It was a community. They loved the Jewish people here, and we were a part of it. My grandfather, as you heard, had a store on N Street. My father performed every year at Yankee Homecoming. My mother was queen of the Yankee Homecoming Parade. And finally, on June 10th in this building, the community honored my father with the largest funeral ever held in this room in the history of it. There were no seats. I spoke, and there'll be another event like that for me ever. So thank you, Congregation of Havas Achim, for being so important to this community. Thank you for nourishing our Jewish history. Thank you for being the bridge over troubled waters for those in need now and hopefully for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name's Richie Weiner. My mother was Sid Weiner, born in 1906. Morris Weiner, my father, came from the West End of Boston, and when my folks got married, he lived in Newburyport until he passed away. My grandparents, Morris and Bryna Edelstein, came from Lithuania, where one aunt and 3 uncles were born there. My aunt Sarah and my mother were born in Newburyport, and all were raised on 25th Street. My mother lived at 25th Street for 90 years. She loved 3 things besides her family: being Jewish, being from Newburyport, and being an Edelstein. Most of the siblings left Fair Street except my mother and father, who took care of my grandparents and raised Paul and me at the Edelstein home. My Uncle Abe Edelstein and his family were the only family members who stayed in Newburyport and were members of the Shoal. His oldest son, Jason, who was inspired by my grandfather, became a rabbi and had a congregation in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My grandfather was on the committee to purchase this synagogue. The original Shoal was on the corner of Liberty and Independence Street. My memories of the Shoal was when I was a boy and was sitting with my grandfather on the left side and the women were seated on the right side. This was a very orthodox way at the Shoal in the early days. Stores in Newburyport in the 40s and 50s, Boxes Furniture, Quality Shoe Store, Elkins Market, Dave Hodge, Nate Settlin, Gordon TV and Sports, Premier Market, Craze Clothing, Puritan Clothing, General Store, Fram's Pharmacy, Harold Hodge Beauty Shop, Cantervitz Army and Navy, Hyman Shoe Store, Green and Water, Tracy's Farm in Newbury, Fram's Market, Liberty Street, Billy Schwartz, Orange Street, Newt Settlin, Market Square, Checkaway Oil, Water Street, Glansburg Stationery, Merrimack Street, Al Blake, Auto Sales in Salisbury, Wine and Check, Market Square, Joe Woodman, Pipe and Metal. If I missed someone, I'm sorry. Albert Colton was the postmaster in Newburyport in the 60s. Bill Colton wrote for the Newburyport Daily News. Doctors in town: Dr. Kirshner, podiatrist; Dr. Berg, eye doctor; Dr. Cohen, eye doctor; Dr. Danis, family practice. And we had a judge, Judge Espovich. And again, if I missed a doctor, I'm sorry. My Jewish identity growing up in Newburyport came from going to ICYC dances in Haverhill and Lawrence. Sorry. A few times a year, I'd go to Salisbury Beach because the North End were full of Jews, because there were no Jews here. In fact, I met my wife's family when I was 10 years old, and here we are together still, 65 years later. This is bad. My mother and me are the same as the Wailing Wall. All we do is cry. My most vivid memory in high school was when I did not play a football game my junior year because it was Yom Kippur. Later, my coach told me how proud he was that I didn't play the game and respected my religion that I did, and my parents, and I didn't play that game. I was the only Jewish kid on the football, basketball, and track team during my 4 years in high school. During the 70s and into the 90s, every year there was an ecumenical game, which were the guys I played sports with during my high school years. Early in the years, we played basketball, and later it was softball. It was the Catholics against the Protestants. The only Jew who played sports in that area, that was me. I had to wait till all the players were chosen, and then I went to the team who didn't have any extra players. Zach Longley was one of the players on the Protestant team who coined the famous phrase I still use today: L'chaim, l'chaim, if we don't beat them, we'll tie them. In closing, I'd like to thank everyone, and you know who you are, that kept our Shabbat morning services going during the past 30 years that I've been back in Newburyport. I love the shul, and it's the foundation of my Jewish life.
Hello, I am Janet Losk, a name that is probably not familiar to many people here. I'm a part of the Colton family, and that name is familiar. Richie just mentioned a couple of the brothers. My father, Bill, was one of 5 siblings, the oldest of 5 siblings, who grew up on Titcomb Street in the Youngman's neighborhood. lots of connections. My experience was a little different from some of the other people in the community. But to backtrack, my Harry Colton, my father's father, was, like so many, an immigrant from Russia. He left his home as a young boy, and as the story tells us, he went to England, where he trained as a tailor, as so many immigrants did, in the establishment company that came to royalty. He came to America in 1903. He worked for a while in Boston and then made his way to Haverhill for quite a few years. He came to Newburyport and settled on Tickham Street in 1917. In addition to his tailoring knowledge, earning a living that way, he also was the first person in both Haverhill and Newburyport to own apartment buildings. So in addition to the 34 Titcomb, he owned the brick building on Washington Street, which is referred to as the Currier Building. I did not know my grandfather, who died several years before I was born. So my memory today is very different. About 2 years ago, I saw a figure telling me what the current number of interfaith families is in today's congregation. I was extremely surprised. I should not have been, because everything has changed through all sorts of organized religion, and the world is a different one, as we all know. But I was surprised because when I grew up here, and while my parents were married in 1936, my first memories of being a part of the show were in the early 50s. At that time, I was part of an extremely small minority. I can remember at that time just 2 other interfaith families, and I felt extremely different here. Although certainly my mother, Raylene Eaton, grew up in Salisbury. She was born in 1912, and she was raised in a very loving, very typical United Methodist home. In fact, at one time, her grandfather, Jacob F. Spalding, was pastor at the East Parish United Church in Salisbury Square. My mother, like so many of her friends, schoolmates, neighbors, must have expected that she too would marry a man from Salisbury and a Methodist man from Salisbury and live a happy life right in Salisbury. But as life happens, and in my case, very happily, my parents did meet. My mother moved across the river and settled in Newburyport. That was very unusual, and really the only one of my mother's close friends who made such a daring move. In 1936, there were very few interfaith marriages anywhere. So it was really most unusual. And as a child growing up here, I did feel very, very different and just different. And this is through a child's eyes. What I realized is that my mother, a very kind and loving person, became very loved by this congregation, very valued by this congregation. And it was a wonderful experience for her. And as I look back, I realize that the real reality is this wonderful acceptance that we all experienced, and the fact that this community valued my mother. Now, of course, I realize that this Jewish tradition has gone back, as we know, many, many years. It was certainly very, very obvious at that time, and it continues. Thank you. Could I take 1 minute for a little anecdote? No. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
A little lift.
I did this at my bat mitzvah as well, just so you know that. Well, I'm Cheryl Fran Blair, and I say that very proudly. And for many years, I used to tell Robin, because we moved to Newburyport, he should have changed his name, but I very proudly took my husband's name. But before I speak about my growing up, there's somebody that I want to make mention of today. Probably, and I know this is fact now, she is the matriarch of our congregation, Anna Kersner. Anna Kersner was one of my mother's best friends. For those of you that don't know my mother, she was Sissy Fram, and when I give that name, I'm sure a lot of people know who I'm talking about now. She and Anna had a mutual admiration society. Anna, for many years, very quietly, without any recognition, made sure that there was a kiddush every Saturday morning in this congregation for at least, and I'm probably underestimating, 20 years. So Anna, I look and I see her pew as I walk in. When you walk in, it's on the left-hand side. When my mother would come to services, the first two people she would look for weren't my brother and I, to make sure we were here. It was to make sure that Anna Kersner and Barbara Hunch were here, because they were her best buds. So now on to me. If you look behind me, you will see this congregation is incredibly meaningful to my family. The parole hut, I think I'm saying it right, it says, in memory of Irving Fram, presented by his grandchildren. The curtain that covers the ark also is in memory of my father. But I'm going to take you back to what a 5-year-old little girl thought of when she came to this incredibly special place. And when I think of it, I went to services here, but downstairs was where I have my memories. So when you walk downstairs today, please take a look, because what's not there is the stage. At the very back, where there is now a classroom, there was a stage, and it was the ultimate to be able to do a performance on that stage. My favorite play, and I remember because we panicked as I was getting ready to come to shul, because we didn't have batteries that worked in the flashlight that I had to use, and blue laws in Massachusetts made it incredibly difficult to get flashlight batteries. My father had to ask the prior owner of his drugstore if it was all right, could he open the store and go get batteries? And every time we each had a line, and there were several of us. I don't know how there were so many Jewish kids at the time, but there were a lot of us, and we were all in line, and we all had, the lights were out, and we all had a line, and as we finished our line, we would say, "Let there be light," and we would turn on our flashlight. And so I needed that flashlight. So please look down there and understand that. And on the side when we finished, Sarah Berkelhammer, and some of you may remember her, would play this big upright piano, and we would all sing. It was just phenomenal. So I am closing in saying that my family, when my boys were bar mitzvahed here, they were 5th generation in my family to become bar mitzvahs. So for us, this is home. This, I never even ever considered that I would ever be a member anywhere but Congregation Ahavas Achim. Thank you.
I don't need this. Hi, everyone. My name is Eileen Harch Grady, and it's my honor and privilege to share some of my memories of this amazing show. Oh, Richie, you got me going. And our Jewish community. Understanding that our audience is comprised of those with deep, rich roots in our Jewish community, and also some new faces, I hope this resonates across the generations old and new. Circle back to November 17th, 2015, sitting in the community room downstairs with Saul Katz and my mother, Barbara Harch, joining us via the phone from her nursing home in Florida, discussing CAA in the Newburyport Jewish community in an interview conducted by Thomas Mila. Saul spoke of his parents who came from the Ukraine in 1913 and started Premier Market out of a horse-drawn carriage that was on loan and a bucket of cucumbers. Alongside his two sisters, Beatrice and Gladys, they ran the family market on 49 Pleasant Street, currently Barron Home, a home goods store, for close to 60 years. The community bid goodbye to Saul at the age of 91 in 2018. My mother met my dad, Harold Harch, in Newburyport, and spoke fondly of raising her family and her treasured memories of CAA. As I sat and listened to the many memories my mom and Saul shared, I was overwhelmed with nostalgia of our beloved family synagogue and filled with way more memories than I could possibly relay in my allotted 5 minutes. My parents, Barbara and Harold, were married on this very bima on June 9th, 1946. My grandparents, Faye, fondly called Fanny, and Davy raised my dad and his two siblings, Jack and Harriet, on Plummer Avenue in Newburyport. My parents raised 6 children, Devorah, Reba, Pasha, or I was told today, Kasha, Rena Shalayim, Penina, Avram, and Ika, that's me, in a predominantly non-Jewish area. They shepherded 6 children through Hebrew school, celebrated 6 bris and 7 brit milahs, those are namings, and over 15 b'nai mitzvahs. Through the course of my family's time at CAA, we welcomed 12 rabbis, including Rabbi Yellen, Black, Zahn, Silber, Wiseman, Kagan, Kaufman, Sadinsky, Wenig, Pupko, Resnick, and of course, our amazing leader and soon-to-be Rabbi, Alex Matthews. Growing up, despite what was happening in our lives, there was never a question that we would ever attend school on the high holidays, and we would always participate in both the synagogue and home seders every year. I can still picture my father in that rear pew, my mother elbowing him while he snored and fell asleep. And all of us kids picked all the little horse hairs out of the pews. The Linskys and the Kirchners in front of us, and Richie Weiner always to the right. Each year, the high holidays would culminate with Barry Pasta blowing the shofar, followed by Nila and the anticipation of breaking fast with the best kugel in the world prepared by Sissy Fram. My family also celebrated 3 generations of board presidents, beginning with my grandfather David in 1968, followed by my dad in 1986 and myself in 2013. My Nana Faye and Mom were both sisterhood presidents and fondly recalled the synagogue and their Jewish friends as their guiding social life. As I reflected on my presidency, I had the distinct honor to watch my daughter Ava complete her bat mitzvah with my mom present in 2012, celebrating 4 generations of the Harnch family. My guiding intuition told me to push Ava to do her bat mitzvah early, and I will forever honor that instinct. Shortly after Ava's bat mitzvah, my mom suffered a massive stroke and lived out the rest of her years in a nursing home in Florida. Each and every week, my mother would receive a card from her dear CAA friend, Sissy Fram, keeping her connected to her Jewish community. My dad, Newburyport's most popular beautician, a beloved city councilor, and also part of urban renewal, could often be found at Angie's with his cronies discussing both his political career and Jewish life. His store on Pleasant Street, Mr. Harold's Beauty Shop, is now Stone Crust Pizza. My Nana Faye Harnch worked at Hardwick's for 25 years. Her store is now Annie's, also on Pleasant Street. My grandfather, Davy, owned David's Antiques on State Street, now Starbucks. Alongside many wonderful times, we also mourned immense loss and said goodbye to Nana, Grandpa, Mom, Dad, Uncle Jack, and my sisters April and Pammy on this bima with standing room only. So thank you, Saul Katz, for the opportunity to reflect on such fond memories made possible through Congregation Ahavas Achim in our Jewish community.
Everyone. My name is Karen Glansberg, and I am delighted to be here and share some memories of being born and raised in Newburyport and being raised in Congregation Ahavas Achim. It is really, I am very appreciative of the opportunity. I'm getting teary now. Many of the people who spoke before me, we have shared memories. We had shared neighborhoods. Bonnie Tucker, I hope you don't mind, was the first child I babysat for. And the Tuckers lived diagonally across the way. The Harnches were across the street. I used to, this is not on my cards, but I used to talk in my sleep and sleepwalk. And for some reason, I called the Harnch house at 2, 3 in the morning, and Barbara Harnch and I had conversations that were kept private. So I will move on, but so many of the memories shared resonate with me. It was a small community. Our Hebrew school, Cheryl Fram has alluded to some of the things, part of my memorabilia downstairs. Oh goodness, I think I'll hold it. Did I break it? Did I? Okay. I always get nervous around a microphone. The kippot, or yarmulkes, from becoming the leader of, we all had to become leader of junior congregation. And it was called then the chazan. In order to learn bat mitzvah training, you had to have gone through this training and led a service. Or one is red velvet, the white satin yarmulke from my bat mitzvah, which took place in 1964, is also downstairs, as well as the Bible presented by the Synagogue Sisterhood. I concentrate, I know we have 5 minutes. I was born in 1951 in Newburyport and raised here, and I was named in the synagogue, as was the custom during the first week of my life. Rabbi Yellen was a young new rabbi. My parents were married in Newburyport. They were married in 1947, and they moved to Newburyport with my aunt and uncle's business, Boxer Furniture. You can see we're all enmeshed in this town. And so that this synagogue, my memory, I only knew how fortunate one, the Rebbe is also my teacher. I will be forever grateful for both of them. Rabbi Yellen, the affection for us. And I want to add two things because my time will go quickly, and I hope. So that is the program from my bat mitzvah in 1964, which is an order of service. And so if you get a chance, it was very rigorous. And in 1964, we had an Orthodox who said, girls must study as intensely as boys. So on the right is myself in the middle, my Filene's basement pot de soie dress from the floor, my sister and my brother, and on the left is the order of service. So I want to point out, even in the 50s and 60s, we had a rabbi and a congregation who believed in egalitarianism. And a group of newlyweds met my parents shortly before I was born. Some of the speakers here, their parents, and were part of the process for Rabbi Yellen. And one of the conditions he made was women will never in this congregation. Rabbi Yellen had some things insisted on too. And the congregation, for instance, the kitchen being strictly kosher, that even though most of the congregation drove on the Sabbath, we never drove in front of the shul. We parked on street. He shut his eyes. We shut eyes. And I wanted to let you know what a dance of love. I couldn't have told you growing up here there was such a thing as Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, or Reconstructionist. I didn't know from that. I knew we were Jews, and this is where we came to pray, to study, to play. Newburyport was a sweet place to grow up. Congregation Ahavas Achim was a sweet place to grow up. This was, the fabric was woven together. My mom was a nurse, labor delivery nurse at the Anna Jakes. She and 5 other nurses in this congregation were the special duty nurses for one in this congregation. Beyond, my father and my mother ran an office equipment business. What I forgot, because I'm going to close. I wanted to say that I left Newburyport. I moved to California. I raised 2 children. The effect of this congregation and strong Jewish upbringing, knowledge. I mean, we were here Sundays. We were here. Albie Colton was my teacher. We were here Tuesdays for religious school, and we were here on Saturdays. This was no cakewalk. While I was in California, I had 2 young children. And I did a career change. And I actually began my career helping congregations set up educational programs and early childhood centers. So I stayed at the first congregation for 20 years. My children are the beneficiary of a congregation like this. And I spoke to my boss today, who was the 4th woman ordained in the United States. My children had 1 rabbi growing up. My children had what we call, this congregation was like Cheers. Everyone knew who you were. Everyone cared. Everyone was invested in you and your family. We didn't talk about service. Our relatives modeled service. We were so fortunate. So I am going to close by saying I am very grateful to have been raised in this congregation, in this Jewish community, and received such a fine, a strong identity, and also to be part of Newburyport, where I was a member. I have to just tell you this, the only church-related youth group that was allowed to go in the first Y pool was the Congregational Church, Pilgrim Fellowship. So we made a deal. I could go to their swim parties if I didn't come in their sanctuary. And and the pastor there. So we were welcome, and in our bar and bat mitzvahs, all of our non-Jewish friends were at this synagogue. So I want to say thank you and play.
Hello, I'm Barry Pastor, and after hearing all these other speakers, I can't believe that having been here since 1973, I'm the youngest of the group. It blows my mind. But I want to talk to you about my first exposure to CAA. My wife and I had just moved from Minneapolis in the fall of 1973. And the first time we were here was for Yom Kippur services. Well, in the Orthodox shul that we came from in Minneapolis, certainly nobody would drive or ride on the high holidays. So what we planned to do was to drive from our home in Amesbury, which is just over the bridge, to drive here before services, stay here for Kol Nidre services, walk home, and walk back in the morning, and then stay for the whole rest of the day and drive home at the end of services. Well, to us, this seemed like the perfectly normal thing to do. So we came and got here in time for Kol Nidre. We stayed for the service. We've enjoyed it very much. We met a lot of people. It's a very heavily attended service. And among the people we met were Bea and Norman Espovich. Now, Bea and Norman were big machas in this shul. They were involved in everything. Everybody knew them, not only in the shul, but all throughout the town. And we were talking to Bea and told her our story that we just moved to town and this is what we planned on doing. Well, she was absolutely aghast. How could you possibly walk back all the way to Amesbury? And of course, back then, the Merrimack River was like the Iron Curtain. Nobody would go from one side to the other. She insisted that we stay at her house overnight. Now, we were perfect strangers. We had never met Bea, we had never met Norman or anyone else in this congregation. She insisted that we stay at her house. So we finally gave in. We walked to her house, which was about half the distance to our own, spent the night, came back in the morning. Now, because it was Yom Kippur, obviously there was no food involved, so it made it a little bit easier. And the point I wanted to make is how welcoming and open this congregation was. We were like Adam and Eve. She didn't know us from a hole in the ground, but insisted that we spend the night in her house. And that was our introduction to CAA, and it's been that way ever since. It's a very open, warming, welcoming congregation. Now, another story that I want to talk about is shown in this picture behind me. Sometime in the early 80s, and for the life of me, I don't know when, a bunch of us decided that since the heating bills in this building were so astronomical, and the fact that there was no insulation anywhere, we were going to insulate the ceiling above this room to keep the heating bills down. It seemed like a perfectly normal idea. I did it in my own house later on. So there were 5 of us involved. Ron Pressler, Jerry Hirsch, Ron Rutchick, Mel Nagler, and myself. And of the 5 of us, 4 of us are here today. It seemed like a great idea. We could help the congregation, we could have a good time, so forth and so on. So in order to get to this ceiling, it's not easy. If you go outside these doors, you'll see a square panel in the ceiling that goes to the ceiling above the lobby. Then you have to climb a ladder to get to the ceiling up here. So we bought oodles of Pink Panther fiberglass insulation, and I brought surgical gowns, surgical masks. Back then, everybody didn't wear a surgical mask every time they went anywhere. Caps and gloves. We had to protect ourselves from the asbestos insulation. So we had people cutting sections and bringing it up and putting it down and so forth and so on. Well, up in that ceiling, there is no floor. All you have is rafters. So you have to be very careful. Well, we all were, even me. However, I slipped off a rafter and put my foot through the ceiling. I took my foot out of that ceiling so fast that when I looked down, pieces of the plaster were still hitting the floor. Needless to say, I was much more careful after that. But the hole in the ceiling remained for several years. Finally, it got patched, and the paint job over the patch was absolutely atrocious. It was a completely different color blue than the rest of the ceiling. And everybody who walked in that door knew why it was there and who did it. Eventually, the ceiling got repaired and repainted, and as you see, it's very nice now. I don't even know where it was. Somewhere over on this side. But the idea is that the people, the members of the congregation, thought enough of this building to go to those extremes to improve it. And that's not the only project. We had a group of people that painted part of the outside of the building at one time. It's a congregation that cares for the building, cares for the people in the congregation, and that continues to this day. Thank you.
My name is Ron Pressler, and as you could see from that photo that, well, it's not there now, or maybe it is, we haven't changed at all. In 1974, I needed a new pair of shoes, and it is because of that Paula and I were introduced to the Newburyport Jewish community. At the corner of Green and Merrimack Street, not Water Street, sir, was the home of Hyman's Shoes. It was a lonely, tired-looking building slated to be torn down to make way for the parking lot we know. And we walked in, sat down, and were pleasantly greeted by an older fellow who introduced himself as Harold. In our back and forth chit-chat, he leaned forward and said, "You must be a landsman." He got up and was off in no time to find the shoes. Surprised by his comment, I leaned to Paula and whispered, "How does he know we're Jewish?" Well, he was back in the flash with a big stack of boxes of shoes. And to make a long story short, I walked out with a fashionable brown pair of Florsheim saddle shoes with a 2-inch heel that went very well with my bell bottoms that were like 12 inches wide. However, before we left, Harold introduced us to his son, Barry, who I just learned, sadly, passed away 2 years ago. in Florida. And Barry was about our age. And Barry and Harold enthusiastically encouraged Paula and me to become part of the synagogue's couples club. We did, and met a new circle of friends. Barbara and Barry Pastor, Adam and Suzanne Paley, Barry and Bunny Podrachik, and a whole slew of other people who settled in Newburyport over the coming years. And we enjoyed progressive dinners, going to restaurants, hay rides in the fall, the theater, summer concerts, and just getting together and schmoozing. On Erev Rosh Hashanah 1975, Paula, our 5-year-old son Matthew, and 2-year-old daughter Lauren entered Ahavas Achim's doors for the first time as members. Until then, we had attended high holidays in Portsmouth where we had been married and Paula grew up. And we decided that it was time to plant roots closer to home. And though at the time we never considered that those roots, those tender roots, would grow so deep. We were a small congregation then, as we are now, but with a very different demographic then. And getting a minyan was not a given. Postcards used to be sent out telling you it was your day and to come and help make a minyan. And if the quota wasn't met, the stalwarts at the time were not above giving a call to someone and say, we need you down here now. And though I didn't have the most solid or exciting Jewish education growing up, I soon got into the habit of coming to services. I became one of the regulars, along with the old timers, Louis Traister, his cousin Sam, Louis Boxer, Elliot Wine, Davy Youngman, Shehakon Yabidvaro, Al Blake, Bill Colton, Joe Woodman, Norman Espovich, and just to name a few. One Shabbat morning, we were about to take out the Torah, and Louis Traister said in his gravelly voice, Ron, you have a pretty good voice. Come up here and lead us. I had not had an aliyah since I became a bar mitzvah, let alone take out the Torah. At that moment, I wanted to be somewhere else. Hesitantly, I walked up and stood beside Louis. He put his hand on my shoulder and quietly said, I'll help you. It wasn't the singing that worried me, but the Hebrew that terrified me. Reading Hebrew still does not come easily to me. With regular attendance and practice and study, I became comfortable leading the Torah service, and in time I learned other parts of the morning services and much more. Well, Louis' simple gesture of placing his firm hand on my shoulder at that moment and his supportive words and encouraging words helped me make it through my trial by fire. In hindsight, he let me know that I had something valuable to contribute to CAA, that I was welcome here, and that the congregation was here for me. I believe the messages Louis communicated unknowingly to me so many years ago are still part of our community. Everyone is welcome and has something to offer to make us a stronger and more vital congregation. Come, be a part of our family. Make yourself comfortable and at home here, as Paula, my wife of 53 years, and I did 47 years ago.
Hi, I'm Mel Nagler, and I'm here with my wife, Joan. And I'm going to tell you the story of our journey here at CAA. We moved from Brookline to Newburyport in 1978. For us, one of the important factors in deciding where to live was that there would be a synagogue with a Hebrew school for the children that we were expecting. So before deciding on Newburyport, we came to a Shabbat service to check it out. At the time, there was a really dwindling membership. There were 3 children in the Hebrew school, and it was really questionable whether this was a viable synagogue or not. But we found the congregants so warm and welcoming, as Barry was referring to, that it won us over, and so here we are. We moved in the week before Rosh Hashanah, and when we came upstairs here for services, B. Espovich, who was alluded to before, met us, and she was like a grand hostess. She introduced us to everybody, and the pastors invited us to sit right over here in the second row, and that's where we've sat for the last 44 years. Right behind us were Bill and Eleanor Mitchell, and B. Gladys and Saul Katz. Not far away was Dora Crone, who was perennially turning 90 or 100, depended on the year. Sam and Louis Traster ran the synagogue. Louis was warm and oversaw the religious services, and Sam ran everything else with an iron fist. Sid Weiner typed the bulletin, and it was mimeographed and sent out to the members. There was no rabbi. Rabbi Yellen had passed. Women were not counted as part of the minyan, the necessary 10 people in order to pray. And the room behind what's now the rabbi's office was the sukkah, which had a retractable roof with pulleys. Our daughter Debbie, who is now president of the board of CAA and chairing this event, not a little bit proud, was born 5 months after we moved in. Barbara Pastor was in the middle of helping Joan clean out our refrigerator when Joan went into labor. And Barry came over and helped me paint the baby's new room. A few other couples joined at that time, and a young couples club was started. It was a great social connection, and we made quick, good friends who we've continued with to this day. At the time, people used to confuse me with Ron Rutchick, who you'll see in a moment, because we were both new, we both wore glasses, we had mustache, and neither of us were gray yet. The congregation struggled to survive, and the finances were in the red every year, as Cheryl could attest to for many years being the treasurer. Despite an incredible range of members' religious observance, when it came to difficulties, the community always came together to keep the congregation open. The doors were always open. But that didn't stop the monthly board meetings from being raucous and chaotic. I remember coming home each time with a bad headache. I also remember a calling committee to make sure that there were enough people coming to every event. Mr. Goldman was our spiritual leader. After several years without a rabbi, membership grew enough so that we could afford a part-time rabbi. And Eileen listed all the rabbis. I'm just going to mention one. When Rabbi Avi Pupko came for his Shabbat weekend interview, afterwards, the only negative comments we got from the congregation was that he said, too often. He was loved for the 5 years he was here, and CAA had a real resurgence with a growing young and family membership. Some of my memories of CAA are Barry's leg coming through this ceiling, I remember that very clearly, a klezmer concert with a packed room and everyone dancing in these aisles, feeling like the floor was going to give way. Also, I remember the annual community breakfast and children's Hanukkah play always filled the social hall. About a dozen years ago, Rabbi Pupko initiated the nightly lighting the menorah in Market Square for Hanukkah. He led congregation trips to Israel and to concentration camps in Poland. And there was a Jewish movie festival culminating in a screening at the firehouse with a party outside on the waterfront park afterwards. He really helped the Jewish community have a presence in Newburyport. For the first time since I was here, we were really out in the community. I also remember 4 years ago, following the Tree of Life shooting at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, the overwhelming support from the local community. This room was so packed, there was no standing room available, and the line was out around the corner. My family has experienced almost a total lack of anti-Semitism in Newburyport. When we first moved in, I asked a neighbor for a carpenter referral, and he asked me if I was Jewish because the carpenter he had in mind didn't work for Jews. That was the only experience we've ever had of an overt act of anti-Semitism. One other quick story about that: when Debbie was 3 years old, she needed a blood test in December. The woman at the lab asked her what Santa Claus was going to bring her, and she said proudly, "I'm Jewish." The woman seemed really surprised and shocked, almost as if she had never met a Jew before, but responded wonderfully. CAA has always been a major focus of our life in Newburyport. Let's face it, there isn't a large local Jewish population, and CAA has provided the community and the underpinning for our Jewish identities to thrive. I served as president twice with my partner in crime, Dennis Eigen. Served as vice president and chair of several committees. Joan was the first professional education director at the synagogue, taught in the Hebrew school. At one point, there were 60 children in the Hebrew school. Joan and Debbie used to bake honey cakes before Rosh Hashanah and deliver them to the elderly members. The bris for Debbie and Daniel's bar mitzvah were here, and then the bris for both of Debbie's sons, Benjamin and Sammy, happened right in this room, marking a third generation for our family at CAA. And that's certainly something I could not have possibly imagined back in 1978. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There's so many great stories to listen to, from people who were born here and to the people who joined at a later time. I see Debbie nervous, so I timed this for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. So we're good. Okay, I just want to share my experience, my early experiences with the Havas Achim, starting with my very first introduction. This goes back to 1978. A lot of people joined in the 70s. And we lived in Newburyport for 7 years, but I'd never taken the first step to find out about the local temple. I had hardly stepped inside a synagogue for 15 years or so. And I really didn't even know who to talk to or even what to ask. So I continued to procrastinate throughout the 70s. I'd driven past the building several times. My mistake was I drove past midweek and the place was shut down. If I'd been thinking, I would have come by on Shabbat and maybe had some better luck. But my calls to the temple went unanswered. I don't think they even had answering machines back then. So when I called, no one was around. Somehow I got a hold of the phone number for Louis Traster, who you've met through Ron Pressler, an elderly man who was president, and apparently he had been president for about 15 years. When I was finally able to get a hold of him, I explained my situation and asked him if he could give me any information about the synagogue. His only reply was a gruff, "Come Friday night, 7:30, you learn." So that Friday night, my son Abraham and I had showed up. He was almost 2 years old. We were greeted by 10 or 12 very elderly men, I guess 70s or 80s, which somehow doesn't seem quite as old right now. But they all greeted us warmly and paid a lot of attention to Abraham, and we felt very welcome. I tried to follow along with the service and with the songs they sang, Lecha Dodi, Yigdal, and others. Eventually, Abraham learned the Shema, and they let him sing the first line alone, which is something he really loved. And I wanted to mention, besides Louis Traister, this group of men, of old men, they referred to themselves as the Old Chestnuts. And I just wanted to mention their names of the ones I can remember. Besides Louis Boxer, Alan Blake, Newt Hunch, Joe Woodman, Dave Youngman, Elliot Wine, Billy Schwartz, and Norman Espovich. And seeing Eileen here and seeing Janet here today, I remembered that Bill Colton would come when he didn't have to work, and Harold Hunch would when he didn't have to work. So those people became very good friends. So for the next 10 months, we attended nearly every Friday night service, but that basically was the extent of my knowledge of Ahavas Hashem. I didn't know much more. So when the high holidays rolled around, I got my true introduction to our congregation. So first day of Rosh Hashanah, I showed up early for the 9 o'clock service because I didn't know about Jewish time. And the sanctuary was practically empty. But soon I was amazed and overwhelmed as the sanctuary began to fill up, hundreds of people almost filling the room to the maximum. People of every age, families, teenagers, elderly, kids, all enthusiastically greeting each other and wishing each other Lashana Tova, Happy New Year. And that was my real introduction to CAA. As with the Old Chestnuts, as they had been, everyone was super friendly and inclusive. And we met many people that week who have remained friends over the decades. One couple who we became very close with was Mel and Joe Nagler. They lived near us in our neighborhood, and they had an adorable little baby girl who had huge dark eyes and a sweet smile. Well, things have come full circle. As you know, she now calls herself Debbie Parati, and she's president of our congregation. So, thank you.
Okay, I'm last, the new kid on the block, as it were. I did not grow up in Newburyport. I do not have several generations of history here. I love this place. I love this city. I love this congregation. When I moved here in 1980, I was really not particularly interested in organized religion. I wasn't looking for a synagogue. I had, in fact, grown up in Brooklyn, New York, in a neighborhood where everyone was Jewish. I did have a really, really wonderful Jewish education. I was very, very blessed and privileged that way. And it's easy to think you can throw away something that came easily. And at that time, I really was in a different place. I would come here for high holiday services, and that was kind of it. When my daughter was about 6 years old and going into public school, she was the only Jewish kid, and it was always still very important to myself and my husband that there be a sense of Jewish identity, but she made it clear to me, we learn a lot from our children, I can tell you that, that if she was going to have a Jewish identity, she really needed to know what that meant. And that meant that she needed to learn. So we found Ahavas Achim, we found the Hebrew school here, and she started learning. At that time,
this congregation was pretty clearly identified with the conservative Jewish movement. The practices were quite traditional, rooted in a patriarchal orientation. And a lot of the prayers seemed to be to an anthropomorphic male deity with whom I did not identify. But over time, because it was such a familiar kind of feeling for me, I did start coming to services. I started being here Saturday mornings because that was the place to be. It had been through my childhood. And as many, many people here have all said, this was a welcoming, very welcoming place. I was really aware, having grown up in a place where everyone was Jewish, that this is not such a place. And that there were really choices to be made about how Jewish we wanted to be. Over time, I got more and more comfortable as people were willing to listen to a voice. Is this working? Yes, okay. And I did ask for change. I struggled for change. There were people who were very uncomfortable with some of the change that I was asking for. I think that Joe Goldman was mentioned here before. He was, just to give you a tiny bit of background, someone who did not live in Newburyport, was a Holocaust survivor who lived in Alston. And for many, many years, when there was no rabbi, and there was no rabbi in those early years, and many years that we were here, he would come up every single Saturday morning, donate his time, his energy, and his quite brilliant mind, and help us to have a Saturday morning service. And then we got to one Saturday morning when he wasn't there. He had had a stroke the day before, and that was the last we saw of him here. We visited him down in Boston, in Brookline, but he never came back here. He had, in some incredibly prescient way, known that there was going to be a need. I really believe that. He encouraged me to learn more. He encouraged me to learn parts of Torah reading, which are really difficult. It's a real long process to really be able to read from the scroll with no vowels, with no punctuation. And it was a real reach for me. But when suddenly he wasn't here, I was the one who could do it better than anyone else. So there it was. It turned out to be one of the most incredible blessings of my life, and I will try to wrap it up. I'm sorry, I know we're running late here. But learning, studying Torah, to share it, to read it, to sing, to chant it, became part of my weekly routine. And what I had thought was a good Jewish background became just really the foundation. I've learned so much more in the last several years with supportive rabbis and congregational leaders, immensely supportive, wonderfully supportive. The congregation has changed. We now identify as non-denominational. It is not at all, as someone previously has said, any sort of unusual occurrence to have mixed marriages and interfaith marriages. It's pretty much the norm. We've become part of the interfaith community, which is one of the things I love about Newburyport, that there really is now. There wasn't so much in our earlier years, but there is now a wonderful interfaith community here. The ministers, the leaders of the churches have by and large been very, very welcoming and inclusive. We now have women who are learning what they never got to learn before to celebrate a bat mitzvah. And as a community, we're growing, we continue to grow. I think that what's kept Judaism alive for these thousands of years is that growth is so much a part of who we are, questioning, struggling, asking, being dissatisfied and scratching the itch and looking to grow. So I really appreciate, welcome, and just have to say a great big thank you to a community that's allowed me to do that, to grow, to learn, and to continue to see growth and learning and change here. Thank you. And that's it.
Hello, I'm Joel Grossman. I'm a newbie. I didn't come till 79. So this is a question and answer period, but we're supposed to end around 6 o'clock, so I think we're only going to have time for 2 or 3 questions. But as has been said, the people who have spoken will be downstairs and available to approach and ask your questions. And there are cards in the back where you can fill out your contact information, your question, and you will be contacted for a chance to speak more. So please have your question be brief, and anybody who's answering the question be brief so we can get a couple in. So who would like to ask a question? Harry Mintz, welcome back to the congregation. Harry was our gabby for many, many years. It's nice to see him again.
But I don't need that. Okay.
No, we're recording.
Amazing memories. I lived here for 25 years. I just have one really important question. You took down the stage in the Youngman Center? I can't believe it.
Someone else have a question? Anybody like to, one more chance? Okay.
Hello? Okay. My name is Lisa Schachtman, and my dad's grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, he lived in Newburyport. We're guessing probably early 1900s to 1920s, and he was the shummus of the congregation. And I'm just curious, do you have any old photos in the attic? Because I know what he looks like.
One more. So we're going to turn it away from the questions now and have Alex, our spiritual leader, conclude the program. And please come downstairs and talk some more and reminisce and ask the panelists questions.
Thanks so much, Joel, and thanks for being flexible with that. I know we didn't leave you quite as much time as you deserved, but if there's any man who knows how to roll with the punches, it's Joel Grossman. Just a couple more quick thank yous before we wrap up, and hopefully we can applaud for all of these people all together. But first, of course, the panel of speakers who shared their memories and just like centuries of Jewish life cumulatively in Newburyport, which is really amazing. And I also really want to thank Debbie Parati and Christine Malpica, who put just countless hours into just today's event and more countless hours into this event, or into the year-long celebration as a whole. And if I thanked everyone else who deserved a thank you, we'd be here till 8 o'clock, which it's time to go downstairs and be in the AC. I just, one last reflection to close is, Mel mentioned the vigil that was held here after the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And speaking to people in the greater Newburyport community, that is probably their #1 association with this synagogue and with this building, which is wonderful in its own way. I was there and I remember just like the overwhelming support that we felt as members of the Newburyport Jewish community at that time. But I'm also really heartened to be standing up here and seeing a room that's not quite as full, but that is very full. And thinking about transitioning from 125 years of history to the next 125 years of history, I would love it to be a narrative where we come here to celebrate, to learn, to have our doors open, to learn from the countless decades and centuries of history that have been living, that is the living Jewish history of Newburyport. And also, I think we've heard kind of how integrated and essential this place is to the Jewish identity of so many people in Newburyport. And I'd love for us to continue the learning and the understanding of just how integral the Jewish community and the CAA community of Newburyport has been to the life and history of the greater Newburyport community. So I'm hoping we can continue to do that in year 126 and 127 and, getting all the way up into the 200s. So thank you all for being here and being part of that history today. And please join us downstairs to have some snacks and continue the conversation.